As someone who grew up in the small town of Merritt in Central California, I've spent over 2 decades surrounded by chilling tales of haunted houses, passed down by friends and family. Growing up on the rougher side of town, life wasn't easy. We didn't have much, but the houses were affordable, and more often than not, they came with ghost stories. In this video, I'll be sharing 8 eerie stories of haunted houses from Merritt that will send shivers down your spine. So, sit back, relax, and prepare to be captivated. Story 1. Back in 1994, my family and I lived in a house on the edge of a farm near the Merritt Farmers Market. At the time, I was just 8 years old, and my younger brother, Michael, was 6. We shared a room with a bunk bed. Me on the bottom bunk since I was older. Some nights, I'd wake up to the sound of footsteps pacing around the room. It wasn't just random footsteps. It sounded like someone walking back and forth, muttering to themselves as if they were upset. The words were muffled, but they seemed to be in Spanish. Occasionally, I'd see a shadow moving across the room. It was dark, but the figure's outline suggested someone wearing an oversized shirt. One night, moonlight streamed through the window, and I could make out the figure more clearly. It was wearing a red shirt. I told my parents about the strange occurrences, but they didn't believe me. Then, one night, things escalated. I woke up to the sound of a loud gunshot right in our room. Michael woke up too, and we were both terrified. We turned on the light, but the room was empty. A moment later, the hallway light flicked on and my dad burst into the room, asking what was going on. We told him about the gunshot, but my parents couldn't find anything unusual. Every window and door was locked and nothing appeared out of place. One evening, as the sun was setting, my mom was outside watering the garden. She spotted a young man in a red shirt walking just beyond our backyard, near the tall, dry flower plants. What scared her most was that the man was bleeding from the side of his head. Startled, she ran inside to get my dad, but when they came back out, the man was gone. After that, my parents decided we had to move. To this day, I don't know if someone had died in our house or if the tragedy happened in my room. Years later, in 2002, the house was torn down to make way for new developments. Story 2. When I was in high school, my family lived in an old house on 19th and O Street, right on the corner by the stop signs. It was one of the strangest places we'd ever lived. One day, my mom picked me up from school and dropped me off at home before heading out to get my sister from Golden Valley High School. I was alone, so I grabbed a snack and settled in. That's when I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, a man was standing outside. He told me his family had lived in the house before us but had moved out about a month earlier. I handed him some of their leftover mail, and then he asked if my parents were home. Not wanting to admit I was alone, I lied and said my dad was in the bathroom. Before leaving, the man said something strange. "Tell your dad that in this house our souls don't always stay with our bodies." I had no idea what he meant. When my mom and sister got home, I told them about the encounter, but they didn't understand it either. A week later, I was playing video games in the living room at sunset. My dad was outside in the backyard, digging a spot for my mom to plant herbs. As it got darker, I heard my dad call through the window, "Tony, bring me a flashlight. It's getting dark." I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, but when I shined the light around, he wasn't there. I even checked the front yard, but it was empty. Confused, I went back inside, only to find my parents just stepping out of the shower. My dad swore he hadn't called me. Another night, I was gaming again when my sister knocked on the front door. I shouted that it wasn't locked, but she kept knocking. Frustrated, I opened the door, and she brushed past me, heading straight to her room without saying a word. About an hour later, at 11 p.m., there was another knock. I opened the door, and there she was, standing outside, asking why I had locked the door. Frozen, I stammered that I hadn't locked it earlier. That's when we both realized something was wrong. Who, or what, had I let in? We searched the house, but no one was there. That night, we ended up sleeping in the living room. Things didn't stop there. One day, my mom dropped me off at Merritt High School, took my sister to Golden Valley, and then ran errands. When she came home, she heard someone singing in my room. Thinking I had skipped school, she went to check, but the room was empty. Panicked, she spent the rest of the day at my aunt's house until it was time to pick me up. Story. In 2006, I moved my family to a house near Tenaya Middle School. It wasn't in the best part of town. Those familiar with the area know it's a place where shootings aren't uncommon. My wife and I had 2 kids at the time, our 2-year-old daughter, Daisy, and our 8-month-old son. Shortly after moving in, I noticed something odd. Daisy, who was still learning to talk, suddenly started babbling a lot more, but not to us. It seemed like she was having full conversations with someone. At first, I brushed it off, thinking she was just pretending or chatting with her toys. Kids that age do that. But what caught my attention was her insistence on calling her Snow White doll Emma. She pronounced the name perfectly, which was strange, considering most of her words were still a bit jumbled. One evening, my wife was dozing on the couch with Daisy in her arms. The house was dark, the TV was playing one of her favorite K-dramas, and our son was already asleep in his room. I went to the kitchen to pack food for work. As I worked, I glanced toward my wife and Daisy. That's when I noticed Daisy's eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. She had this unsettling smile on her face, like she was trying to tell me something. I assumed it was just the flicker of the TV light playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, she was still smiling. Feeling a little creeped out, I turned on the kitchen light. This time, Daisy was sound asleep. I chalked it up to my imagination and went on with my night. After packing up the food, I woke my wife and carried Daisy to her room. A few nights later, my wife wasn't feeling well, so I told her to head to bed while I put the kids down. Daisy was already fast asleep in her room, so I focused on our baby boy. He wouldn't settle unless I held him. As I rocked him to sleep, I noticed Daisy standing in the doorway of the baby's room. "Go back to bed," I told her softly. She turned and walked away, but a couple of minutes later she was back, just standing there and staring at me. "Daisy, go to bed," I said again, but she didn't budge. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on me. By the 3rd time, I was getting frustrated. After I finally managed to put the baby down, I looked up to see Daisy walking back to her room. I followed her to make sure she actually got into bed, but when I opened her door, she was already tucked in, sound asleep. I shook her awake gently. "Were you just in the baby's room?" Her sleepy reply was, "No, Daddy." That was enough for me. I told her to grab her blanket and sleep with her mom and me that night. I also went back to get the baby, and we all stayed together in one room. After that incident, my wife confessed that she often felt like someone was watching her when she was alone in the house. I believed her now. Not long after, we moved into a small apartment. I'll never forget Daisy's parting question while we were packing. "Why aren't we taking Emma with us?" Thinking she meant her Snow White doll, I said, "Emma's right there in your hand." She shook her head. "No, Daddy, this is Snow White." Before I could react, my wife stepped in. "Emma's mommy and daddy will come get her later, sweetheart. Don't worry about Emma." Later, my wife admitted that she'd also thought Daisy had named the doll Emma. We couldn't explain it. Maybe a little girl named Emma had lived and died in that house. Stories. There's a small town called Winton in Merritt County. It's peaceful and quiet at night, but there's an eerie stillness to it, especially in the countryside. I used to date a girl named Lucy who lived out there. Lucy's family had been in their house for over 10 years. Her mother, however, had passed away in that house after battling a long illness. I wasn't sure what she'd been sick with, but Lucy told me a little about her mother's history. Before moving to the US, Lucy's family lived in Thailand. Her father had been unfaithful, and her mother's jealousy drove her to attempt poisoning herself. She fell into a coma, and for a time people believed she was dead. A grandmother came to perform a ritual, chanting in a language no one recognized, and after hours, Lucy's mother woke up. People said she had become half human, half spirit after that. Her health never fully recovered, and when they moved to the US, she had 2 more children before passing away. Lucy's father remarried, and her new stepmother brought 3 kids of her own into the family. They all lived together, farming on the outskirts of Winton. One early morning, I was helping Lucy's family prepare for a religious ceremony. It was around 6 a.m., and Lucy's dad and her 2 older brothers were outside, getting ready to butcher a pig. I was helping set up in the garage when strange things started happening. Items on the shelves began falling to the floor, one by one. I froze, watching in disbelief. Goosebumps covered my skin. And Lucy noticed my reaction and said calmly, "Don't worry, it's just my mom." Lucy's family kept saying it was just their mom, but honestly, that only made it creepier for me. It seemed like they'd grown so used to these strange happenings that they weren't afraid anymore. One evening, just as the sun was setting, Lucy and I were sitting in her backyard, snacking on cucumbers and chatting. On the right side of the yard was a tall patch of corn and sugarcane. Out of the corner of my eye, I kept seeing what looked like someone standing in the middle of the corn, watching us. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The light was fading and the stalks were casting long, eerie shadows, but as I squinted, I could vaguely make out the outline of a figure among the plants. Something about it felt familiar. I was convinced it was Lucy's mother. Then Lucy's sister came out and asked her to help with dinner. Lucy went inside first, but before I followed, I glanced back toward the cornfield. This time, I saw the figure squat down, as if trying to hide. My heart raced. I wasn't imagining it. Another time, after Lucy and I had gone out to a late movie, I dropped her off at her house. I waited in the car to make sure she got inside safely. Once she closed the door behind her, I started backing out of the driveway. But something caught my eye. Standing near the corner of the house, partially hidden by banana tree leaves, was a woman in traditional funeral clothes. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I didn't need to. I knew what I was looking at. I didn't stick around. I just drove off. I cared for Lucy deeply, but when I was dating her, I was always sick. I'd drive 2 hours from Turlock to Winton just to see her, but my health seemed to worsen every time I visited. I never told my parents about what I'd seen, though. They just assumed I was sick from overworking or stress. My family practiced shamanism, and every year we had a shaman perform a ritual to ensure everything in the spiritual realm was balanced. During one of these rituals, the shaman encountered Lucy's mother's spirit. He didn't know anything about Lucy or her family, but he described her mother in vivid detail. The shaman told my parents that Lucy's mother didn't want me visiting her daughter anymore. When my parents brought this up, I finally confessed everything I'd seen and experienced. They told me to stop visiting Lucy. It was hard, but I slowly stopped calling her and visiting. We never officially broke up, we just stopped. Over time, we both moved on with our lives, but even now, I think about her sometimes. Story 15. Back in 1991, my family and I lived in a house off Gerrard Avenue near Coffee Road. It's all gone now, torn down to make way for a shopping center. But back then, it was a quiet countryside spot, not far from Highway 99. The house always smelled like cigarettes. My parents figured the previous owners must have been heavy smokers, but the odd thing was, the smell seemed to come from the vents. One night, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. As I stepped out of my room, I glanced toward the living room and froze. Sitting on the couch was a middle-aged white woman with curly hair. She had a cigarette in her hand and was staring right at me. Before I could process what I was seeing, she stood up and started walking toward me. Terrified, I bolted back to my room, completely forgetting about the bathroom. I saw her a few more times after that. Each time it was late at night and she was always in the living room, smoking. I told my parents, but they didn't believe me. I was just a kid after all. Ever since we moved into that house, my mom had complained of chest pains. She said it felt like something heavy was sitting on her chest at night, making it hard to breathe. She described it as a kind of sleep paralysis. In 1993, my mother passed away from a blood clot in her heart. After her death, we moved out of the house in 1995. One day, not long after we'd moved, a man called our home. I answered the phone and passed it to my dad, who put it on speaker while he finished something in the kitchen. The man said his family had moved into our old house. He wanted to know if we'd ever experienced anything strange while living there. My dad hesitated before telling him about the white woman I used to see. The man then revealed that his daughter had also been seeing someone in the house, but it wasn't a white woman. His daughter kept seeing an Asian woman with short, shoulder-length hair sitting by the living room window at night, knitting. My dad's face went pale. We both knew who the man's daughter had seen. It was my mother. The man also mentioned that his wife had started experiencing the same chest pains my mom had described. She, too, felt like something heavy was pressing down on her at night. My dad told him to get his family out of that house immediately. That house was always strange. I wasn't sad to see it go when they tore it down. Story 6. Story 1. One morning I woke up early, what I thought was 6 a.m., and went to the couch. The house was quiet, and no one else was awake. I decided to watch cartoons, but oddly, my usual channel wasn't showing anything. I lay there, drifting in and out of sleep, feeling a bit disoriented. Out of nowhere, my dad smacked my legs with his sandal, jolting me awake. "Where have you been all day?" he yelled, continuing to hit me. I started crying, confused and scared. My mom rushed in to stop him. Once I'd calmed down, my mom asked me, "Where have you been all day?" I told her I'd just woken up and had been sleeping before that. She stared at me, bewildered. "It's 6 p.m., not a.m.?" I couldn't wrap my head around it. I distinctly remembered going to bed the night before and waking up, but apparently I'd been missing the entire day. My family said they couldn't find me anywhere in the house. During that time, they'd even called my grandpa a medicine man and spiritual healer. He performed a ritual and told my parents that I was still somewhere in the house, but for some reason, they couldn't see me. That weekend, my grandpa came over and did another ritual. He explained that I'd been hidden by children, spirits, who lived in our house. According to him, they'd taken me to play in the cemetery across the street during the time I was gone. He advised my parents to move out because living so close to the cemetery wasn't good for us. 2 months later, we left that house. Child Avenue is a strange place. Even today, there are so many accidents on that road, and more often than not, the people involved in those crashes don't make it. Story 7. When I was younger, my family lived in a house near the train tracks, close to Hoover Middle School. It was a strange area, and people often said it felt heavy. Not far from us was the spot where a woman had taken her own life by standing on the tracks. It became a terrorist site. On one side of the train tracks, there were new houses with modern designs. On the other side, where we lived, were older homes with big backyards. Our next-door neighbor was an elderly white lady who lived alone. She was kind to us and had a huge backyard with several fruit trees, including a cherry tree in the middle. Every spring, she'd let us pick the cherries, saying they'd go to waste if we didn't. But in the fourth spring, something felt off. The cherries were ripening on the tree, some already turning black or falling to the ground, but the old lady never came to invite us to pick them. One afternoon, my parents were in our backyard watering their herbs, and we kids were playing nearby. My mom wrinkled her nose and said, "What's that smell? It smells like something's dead." My dad nodded. "It's coming from her house." Curious, my dad climbed the fence to look into her yard. I watched as he scanned the area and then froze. He turned back to us, his face pale. "There are flies all over her kitchen window." My mom looked worried. "Something's not right." After finishing up in the yard, my dad asked me to go with him to knock on her door. We went over and he knocked several times, but no one answered. He peered through the window, and as a car passed by, its headlights lit up the dark hallway inside. Standing there, in a white gown, was the old lady. Her hair was messy, and she was staring directly at him. Startled, my dad pulled back. "Let's go home. Call 911. Call 9." We hurried back and I made the call, since my dad didn't speak much English. I explained that we hadn't seen our neighbor in a while and that there was a strange smell coming from her house. 5 minutes later, a police officer arrived. My family waited outside while my dad and the officer went to check her out. The officer managed to get the front door open, and my dad followed him inside. The stench was overwhelming. Flies were everywhere. They found the old lady in her bedroom. She was still alive, but couldn't move. She was delirious, muttering nonsense, and her condition was horrifying. Her right leg had severely rotted, her skin was dry, and she was extremely dehydrated. An ambulance arrived quickly, but sadly, she passed away in the hospital a short time later. The doctors said she died from extremely high blood sugar and septic shock. According to the report, there was no foul play or break-in. They believed she'd nicked her skin while cutting her toenails, and because of her diabetes, the wound never healed. It got infected and caused her leg to decay. After her death, 2 different families moved into her house, but neither stayed for long. Each left after just a few weeks. Eventually, the house was boarded up and fenced off. It stayed that way for 2 years before someone finally bought and remodeled it. We moved to Atwater by then, so we never found out if the house ended up being haunted. Story 8. We used to live in one of those older houses near the Merced DMV. Back then, I had a friend named Cha. Cha was lucky. He had both a Super Nintendo and a Sega Genesis, plus a huge collection of games. The ones I really wanted were Mortal Kombat and Killer Instinct, but I didn't have either. One day, Cha's grandpa passed away in their house. He'd been sick for a long time and was completely blind. At the time, the local funeral home in Merced didn't allow overnight stays. I'm not sure if that's still the case now. The secretary went from his barracks to the funeral home and put together the coffins, disclosing the largest amount of dirt I'd ever seen. On the first day of his grandpa's funeral, I went with Cha and some of our friends. I remember Cha's dad filming the ceremony with a camcorder, planning to send the recording to his younger brother in Thailand. The funeral home closed at 9 p.m., so we all left and went home. They reopened it early the next morning. On the second day, I attended the funeral again. Cha and his entire family were there, so I knew no one was home. As the sun began to set, I decided it was time to head back. But instead of going straight home, I had another idea. I drove over to Cha's house, snuck into their backyard, and climbed through the window of Cha's sister's room. I knew exactly where Cha kept his games. Most of them were in his and his little brother's room, while the consoles were hooked up in the living room. I started going through their stash of games, looking for the ones I wanted to take. As I was searching, I suddenly heard the TV in the living room turn on. At first, I froze. The sound coming from the TV was strange. It was the funeral. I could hear crying, mourning, and the distinct notes of funeral instruments. For a moment, I thought Cha's family had come back early. Panicked, I hid under the bed and peeked out into the hallway. But the house was eerily quiet. I could still hear the funeral playing on the TV, but there were no voices, no footsteps, nothing. Realizing no one was there, I went back to looking for games. I grabbed a few, but couldn't find Mortal Kombat or Killer Instinct. I figured they might be in the living room where the TV was playing. The house was getting darker, except for the light coming from the living room. I crept down the hallway and peeked in. That's when I saw it. Cha's grandpa was sitting on the sofa, watching his own funeral on TV. My heart nearly stopped. I couldn't understand it. He was supposed to be blind, but his cloudy white eyes were blinking, and he seemed completely focused on the screen. I studied his face in the photo, was terrified. I ran back to Cha's sister's room, climbed out the window, and got into my car. I didn't stop driving until I was home. Looking back, I wonder if Cha's grandpa didn't realize he was dead yet. Maybe that's why he was still sitting in the house, watching his own funeral play out at the funeral home. That wraps up this story. Thanks for sticking with me all the way through and supporting my collection of stories. I hope you have a wonderful day or night, wherever you are.